Memories, Dreams, Reflection by C.G. Jung, Chapter 12, Late Thoughts. Any biography of myself must, I think, take account of the following reflections. It is true that they may well strike others as highly theoretical, but making theory, a footnote to theory, in the original sense of the Greek theorem, looking around the world, or the German Weltanschauung, A.J., end of footnote. But making theory of this sort is as much a part of me, as a vital function of mine, as eating and drinking. Part 1. What is remarkable about Christianity is that in its system of dogma it anticipates the metamorphosis in the divinity, a process of historical change on the quote-unquote other side. It does this in the form of the new myth of dissension in heaven, first alluded to in the creation myth, in which the serpent-like antagonist of the Creator appears and lures people to disobedience by the promise of increased conscious knowledge, scientis bonum et malum. The second allusion is to the fall of the angels, a premature invasion of the human world by unconscious contents. The angels are a strange genius. They are precisely what they are, and cannot be anything else. They are in themselves soulless beings, who represent nothing but the thoughts and intuitions of their Lord. Angels who fall, then, are exclusively bad angels. These releases of the well-known effect of inflation, which we can also observe nowadays in the megalomania of dictators. The angels beget with men a race of giants, which ends by threatening to devour mankind, as is told in the Book of Enoch. The third and decisive stage of the myth, however, is the self-realization of God in human form in fulfillment of the Old Testament idea of the divine marriage and its consequences. As early as the period of primitive Christianity, the idea of the incarnation has been refined to include the intuition of Christ within us. Thus, the unconscious wholeness penetrated into the psychic realm of inner experience, and people were made aware of all that entered into their true configuration. This was a decisive step, not only for people, but also for the Creator, who, in the eyes of those who had been delivered from darkness, cast off his dark qualities and became summum bonum. This myth remained unassailably vital for a millennium, until the first signs of a further transformation of consciousness began appearing in the 11th century. Footnote C. Ion, page 82 ff. End of footnote. From then on, the symptoms of unrest and doubt increased until the end of the second millennium. The outlines of the universal catastrophe became apparent, at first in the form of a threat to consciousness. This threat consists in giantism, in other words, the hubris of consciousness and the assertion, quote, nothing is greater than man and his deeds, unquote. The otherworldliness, the transcendence of the Christian myth was lost, and with it the view that wholeness is achieved in the other world. Light is followed by shadow, the other side of the Creator. This development reached its peak in the 20th century. The Christian world is now truly confronted by the principle of evil, by naked injustice, tyranny, lies, slavery, coercion of consciousness. Coercion of conscious, not consciousness. This manifestation of naked evil has assumed apparently permanent form in the Russian nation, but its first violent eruption came in Germany. That outpouring of evil revealed to what extent Christianity had been undermined in the 20th century. In the face of that, evil can no longer be minimized by the euphemism of privatio boni. Evil has become a determinate reality. It can no longer be dismissed from the world by circumlocution. We must learn how to handle it, since it is here to stay. How can we live with that without terrible consequences? Cannot for the present be conceived. How we can live with it without terrible consequences cannot for the present be conceived. In any case, we stand in need of a reorientation, a metanoia. Touching evil brings with it grave peril of succumbing to it. We must therefore no longer succumb to anything at all, not even to good. A so-called good to which we succumb loses its ethical character. Not that there is anything bad in it on the score, but to have succumbed to it may breed trouble. Every form of addiction is bad, no matter whether the narcotics be alcohol or morphine or idealism. We must beware of thinking of good and evil as absolute opposites. The criterion of ethical action can no longer consist in the simple view that good has the force of a categorical imperative, while so-called evil can resolutely be shunned. Recognition of the reality of evil necessarily revitalizes the good, and the evil likewise converting both into the halves of a paradoxical whole. In practical terms, this means that good and evil are no longer so self-evident. We have failed to realize that each represents a judgment. In view of the fallibility of all human judgment, we cannot believe that we will always judge rightly. We might so easily be victims of misjudgment. The ethical problem is affected by this principle only to the extent that we become somewhat uncertain about moral evaluations. Nevertheless, we have to make ethical decisions. The relativity of good and evil by no means signifies that these categories are invalid or do not exist. Moral judgment is always present and carries with it characteristic psychological consequences. I have pointed out many times that in the past, so in the future, the wrong we have done, thought, or intended will wreak its revenge on our souls. Only the contents of judgment are subject to the differing conditions of time and place, and therefore take correspondingly different forms. For moral evaluation is always founded upon the apparent certitudes of a moral code, which pretends to know precisely what is good and what is evil. But once we know how uncertain the foundation is, ethical decision becomes a subjective creative act. We can convince ourselves of its validity only deo coincidenti, that is, there must be a spontaneous and decisive impulse on the part of unconscious. Ethics itself, the decision between good and evil, is not affected by this impulse, only made more difficult for us. Nothing can spare us the torment of ethical decision. Nevertheless, harsh as it may sound, we must have the freedom in some circumstances to avoid the known moral good and do what is considered to be evil, if our ethical decision so requires. In other words, again, we must not succumb to either of the opposites. A useful pattern is provided by the Nityaniti of Indian philosophy. In given cases, the moral code is undeniably abrogated and ethical choice is left to the individual. In itself, there is nothing new about this idea. In pre-psychology days, such different choices were also known and came under the heading of conflict of duties. As a rule, however, the individual is so unconscious that they altogether fail to see their own potentialities for decision. Instead, they are constantly and anxiously looking around for external rules and regulations that can guide them in their perpetuity. Aside from general human inadequacy, a good deal of the blame for this rests with education, which promulgates the old generalizations and says nothing about the secrets of private enterprise. Thus every effort is made to teach idealistic beliefs or conduct which people know in their hearts they can never live up to, and such ideas are preached by officials who know they themselves have never lived up to these high standards and never will. What is more, nobody ever questions the value of this kind of teaching. Therefore, the individual who wishes to have an answer to the problem of evil, as it is posed today, has need, first and foremost, of self-knowledge, that is, the utmost possible knowledge of their own wholeness. She must know relentlessly how much good she can do and what crimes she is capable of, and must beware of regarding the one as real and the other as illusion. Both are elements within her nature, and both are bound to come to light in her, should she wish, or as she ought, to live without self-deception or self-delusion. In general, however, most people are hopelessly ill-equipped for living on this level, although there are also many persons today who have the capacity for profounder insight into themselves. Such self-knowledge is of pure importance because through it we approach the fundamental stratum or core of human nature, where all instincts dwell. Here are the pre-existent dynamic factors which ultimately govern the ethical decision of our consciousness. This core is the unconscious and its contents concerning which we cannot pass any final judgment. Our ideas about it are bound to be inadequate, for we are unable to comprehend its essence cognitively and set rational limits to it. We achieve knowledge of nature only through science, which enlarges consciousness. Hence, deepened self-knowledge also requires science, that is, psychology. No one builds a telescope or microscope, with one turn of the wrist, out of goodwill alone, without a knowledge of optics. Today we need psychology for reasons that involve our very existence. We stand perplexed and stupefied before the phenomenon of Nazism and Bolshevism because we know nothing about man, or at any rate have only a lopsided and distorted picture of people. If we have self-knowledge, that would not be the case. We stand face to face with the terrible question of evil and do not know what it is before us, let alone what to pit against it. And even if we did know, we would still not understand how it could have happened here. With glorious naivety, a statement comes out with a proud declaration that he has no imagination for evil. Quite right. We have no imagination for evil, but evil has us in its grip. Some do not want to know this, and others are identified with evil. That is a psychological situation in the world today. Some call themselves Christian and imagine that they can trample so-called evil underfoot by merely willing to. Others have succumbed to it and no longer see the good. Evil today has become a visible great power. One half of humanity battens and grows strong on a doctrine fabricated by a human ratiocination. The other half sickens from the lack of myth commensurate with the situation. The Christian nations have come to a sorry pass. Their Christianity slumbers and has neglected to develop its myth further in the course of the centuries. Those who gave expression to the dark stirrings of growth in the mythic ideas were refused a hearing. Giacchino di Fiore, Master Eckhart, Jacob Borme, and many others have remained obscurists for the majority. The only ray of light is Pius XII and his dogma. Footnote. See above chapter 7, page 202. But people do not know what I am referring to when I say this. They do not realize that a myth is dead if it no longer lives and grows. Our myth has become mute and gives no answers. The fault lies not in it as it is set down in the scriptures, but solely in us, who have not developed it further, who rather have suppressed any such attempts. The original version of the myth offers ample points of departure and possibilities of development. For example, the words are put into Christ's mouth, quote, "Be ye therefore wise as serpents and harmless as doves," unquote. For what purpose do people need the cunning of serpents? Now, what is the link between this cunning and the innocence of a dove? Quote, "Except ye become as little children," unquote. Who gives thought to what little children are like in reality? By what morality did the Lord justify the taking of the ass which he needed in order to ride in triumphant into Jerusalem? How was it that short afterward he put it on a display of childish bad temper and cursed the fig tree? What kind of morality emerges from the parable of the unjust steward, and what profound insight of such far-reaching significance for their own predicament? The apocryphal Logan, quote, "Man, if thou knowest what thou done, thou art blessed. If thou knowest not, thou art accursed and transgressor of the law," unquote. Footnote, Codex Brazier ad Lucum 6:4. End footnote. Let's see, where were we? There we are. What finally does it mean when St. Paul confesses, quote, "The evil which I would not, what that I do," unquote? I will not discuss the transparent prophecies of the book of Revelation, because no one believes in them, and the whole subject is felt to be an embarrassing one. The old question posed by the Gnostics, whence comes evil, has been given no answer by the Christian world, and the Origen's cautious suggestion of a possible redemption of the devil was deemed a heresy. And this is Origen, Origen, anyway. Today we are compelled to meet that question, but we stand empty-handed, bewildered, and perplexed, and cannot get it into our heads that no myth will come to our aid, although we have such urgent need of one. As the result of the political situation and the frightened, not to say diabolic triumphs of science, we are shaken by secret shudders and dark forebodings, but we know no way out, and very few persons indeed draw the conclusion that this time the issue is long since forgotten, the long since forgotten soul of people. A further development of myth might well begin with the outpouring of the Holy Spirit upon the apostles, by which they were made into sons of God, and not only they, but all others, who through them and after them received the filatio, sonship of God, and thus partook of the certainty that they were more than auto Chthonios animalia, sprung from the earth, that as a twice born they had their roots in the divinity itself. Their visible physical life was on the earth, but the invisible inner person had come from the and would return to the primordial images of wholeness, to the eternal Father, to the Christian myth of salvation, puts it. Just as the Creator is whole, so is her creation, her Son, ought to be whole. Nothing can take away from the concept of divine wholeness, but unbeknownst to all, a splitting of that wholeness ensured. There emerged a realm of light and a realm of darkness. This outcame even before Christ appeared, was clearly prefigured, as we may observe in the inner aliyah of the experience of Job, or in the widely disseminated book of Enoch, which belongs to immediate pre-Christian times. In Christianity, too, this metaphysical split was plainly perpetuated. Satan, who in the Old Testament still belonged to the intimate entourage of Yahweh, now formed the diametrical and eternal opposite of the divine world. He could not be uprooted. It is therefore not surprising that as early as the beginning of the 11th century the belief arose that the devil, not God, had created the world. Thus the keynote was struck for the second half of the Christian eon, after the myth of the fall of the angels had already explained that these fallen angels had taught men a dangerous knowledge of science and arts. What would those old storytellers have to say about Hiroshima? The visionary genius of Jacob Boehme recognized the paradoxical nature of the God image and thus contributed to the further development of the myth. A mandala symbol sketched by Boehme, footnote reproduced in the Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious, page 297, is representation of the split God, for the inner circle is divided into two semicircles standing back to back. Since dogma holds that God is wholly present in each of the three persons, he is also wholly present in each part of the outpouring Holy Spirit, and thus every person can partake of the whole God, and hence the filiation. The complexio oppositoria of the God image thus enters into a person, and not as a unity, but as a conflict, the dark half of the image coming into opposites, with the accepted view that God is light. This very process is taking place in our own times, albeit scarcely recognized by the official teachers of humanity, whose task supposedly is to understand such matters. There is a general feeling, to be sure, that we have reached a significant turning point in the ages, but people imagine that the great change has to do with nuclear fission and fusion, or with space robots. What is currently taking place in the human psyche is usually overlooked. Insofar as the God image is, from a psychological point of view, a manifestation of the ground of the psyche, and insofar as the cleavage in that image is becoming clear to mankind as a profound dichotomy which perpetuates even into world politics, a compensation has arisen. This takes the form of circular symbols of unity which represent a synthesis of the opposites within the psyche. I refer to the worldwide rumors of the unidentified flying objects, of which we began to hear early in 1945. These rumors are founded either upon visions or upon actual phenomena. The usual story about the UFOs is that they are some kind of spacecraft coming from other planets or even from the fourth dimension. Many years earlier, in 1918, in the course of my investigation of the collective unconscious, I discovered the presence of an apparently universal symbol of a similar type, a mandala symbol. To make sure of my case, I spent more than a decade amassing additional data, therefore announcing my discovery for the first time. Footnote in the commentary, The Secret of the Golden Flower, 1931. The mandala is an archetypal image whose occurrence is attested throughout the ages. It signifies the wholeness of the self. The circular image represents the wholeness of the psychic ground, or, to put it in mythic terms, the divinity incarnate in persons, people. In contrast with Bohmi's mandala, the modern one strives for unity. They represent a compensation of the psychic cleavage, or an anticipation that the cleavage will be surmounted. Since this process takes place in the collective unconscious, it manifests itself everywhere. The worldwide stories of the UFOs are evidence of that. They are the symptom of a universally present psychic disposition. Insofar as analytical treatment makes the shadow conscious, it causes a cleavage and a tension of opposites, which in their turn seek compensation in unity. The adjustment is achieved through symbols. The conflict between the opposites constrain our psyche to the breaking point if we take them seriously, or if they take us seriously. The tertium non datur of logic proves its worth. No solution can be seen. If all goes well, the solution, seemingly of its own accord, appears out of nature. Then and only then is it convincing. It is felt as grace. Since this solution proceeds out of the confrontation and the clash of opposites, it is usually an unfathomable mixture of conscious and unconscious factors, and therefore a symbol, a coin split into two halves, which fit together precisely. Footnote: one of the meanings of the symbol in the tessera hospitalitis, between host and guest, the broken coin which is shattered between two parting friends. End of footnote. It represents the result of the joint labors of the consciousness and the unconscious, and attains the likeness of the God image in the form of the mandala, which is probably the simplest model of a concept of wholeness, and one which spontaneously arises in the mind as a representation of the struggle and reconciliation of opposites. The clash, which is at first the pure personal nature, is soon followed by the insight that the subjective conflict is only a single instance of the universal conflict of opposites. Our psyche is set up in accord with the structure of the universe, and what happens in the microcosm likewise happens in the infinitesimal and most subjective realm of the psyche. For that reason, the God image is always a projection of the inner experience of the powerful vis-a-vis. That is symbolized by objects from which the inner experience has taken its initial impulse, and which, from then on, preserve numinous significance, or else it is characterized by its numinosity and the overwhelming force of that numinosity. In this way, the imagination liberates itself from the concretism of the object and attempts to sketch the image of the invisible as something which stands behind the phenomenon. I am thinking here of the simplest basic form of the mandala, the circle, and the simplest mental division of the circle, the quadrant, or as that the case may be, the cross. Such experiences have a helpful, or as it may be, annihilating effect on people. One cannot grasp, comprehend, dominate them, nor can one free oneself or escape from them, and therefore one feels them as overpowering. Recognizing that they do not spring from one's conscious personally, one calls them mana, a daimon, or God. Science employs the term the unconscious, thus admitting that it knows nothing about them, for it can know nothing about the substance of the psyche when the sole means of knowing anything is the psyche. Therefore, the validity of such terms as mana, daimon, or God can be neither disproved nor affirmed. We can, however, establish that the sense of strangeness connected with the experience of something objective, apparently outside the psyche, is indeed authentic. We know that something unknown, alien, does come our way, just as we know that we do not know ourselves. Just as we know that we do not ourselves make a dream or an inspiration, but that it somehow arises of its own accord. What does happen to us in this manner can be said to emulate from mana, not from a daimon, a god, or the unconscious. The first three terms have a great merit of including and evoking the emotional quality of numinosity, whereas the latter, the unconscious, is banal and therefore closer to reality. This later concept includes the empirical realm, that is, the commonplace reality we know so well. The unconscious is too neutral and rational a term to give much impetus to the imagination. The term, after all, was coined for scientific proposals and is far better suited to dispassionate observation, which makes no metaphysical claim, than are the transcendental concepts, which are controversial and therefore tend to breed fanaticism. Hence, I prefer the term the unconscious, knowing that I might equally well speak of God or daimon, but if I wish to express myself in mythic language. When I do use such mythic language, I am aware that man, a daimon, and God are symbols of the unconscious, that is to say, we know that just as much or just as little about them as the latter. People only believe they know much more about them, and for certain purposes that belief is far more useful and effective than a scientific concept. The great advantage of the concepts of daimon and God lie in the making possible a much better objectification of vis-a-vis, namely a personification of it. Their emotional quality confers life and effectuality upon them. Hate and love, fear and reverence enter the scene of the confrontation and raise it to a drama. What has merely been displayed becomes acted. Footnote. Cf. Transformation Symbolism in the Mass in Psychology and Religion, West and East, CW, page 249 to 50. All right. The whole person is challenged and enters the fray with their total reality. Only then can one become whole, and only then can God be born. That is, enter into human reality and associate with a person in the form of a person. By this act of incarnation, people, that is, one's ego, is inwardly replaced by God, and God becomes outwardly a person, in keeping with the saying of Jesus, "Who sees me sees my Father." It is at this point that the shortcomings of mythic terminology become apparent. The Christian's ordinary conception of God is of an omnipotent, omniscient, and all-merciful Father and Creator of the world. If this God wishes to become a man, an incredible kenosis, emptying, footnote Philippians 2:9. A tremendous kenosis or emptying is required of him in order to reduce his totality to the this is him capital and his totality capital, to the infinitesimal human scale. Even then it is hard to see why the human frame is not shattered by the incarnation. Theological thinkers have themselves felt it necessary to equip Jesus with qualities which raise him above ordinary human existence. Above all, he lacks macula peccati, stain of original sin. For that reason, if for no other, he is at least a God-man or demigod. The Christian God-image cannot become incarnate in empirical man without contradictions, quite apart from the fact that people, with all their external characteristics, seem little suited to representing a god. The myth must ultimately take monotheism seriously and put aside its dualism, which, however much repudiated officially, has persisted until now and enthroned an eternal dark and agnostic alongside the omniscient good. Room must be made within the system for the philosophical complexo oppositorium of Nicholas de Cusa and the moral ambivalence of Jacob Boehme. Only thus can the one God be granted the wholeness and the synthesis of opposites which should be his, capital H. It is a fact that symbols by their very nature can so unite the opposites and that these no longer diverge or clash, but mutually supplement each other and give meaningful shape to life. Once that has been experienced, the ambivalence of the image of the God-nature or Creator God ceases to present difficulties. On the contrary, the myth of the necessary incarnation of God, the essence of the Christian message, can then be understood as people's creative confrontation with the opposites and their synthesis in the self and the wholeness of their personality. the unavoidable internal contradictions in the image of the Creator God can be reconciled in unity and wholeness of the self, as the conjunctio oppositorium of the alchemists, or the unio mystica. In the experience of the self, it is no longer the opposite God and man that are reconciled as it was before, but rather the opposites within the God image itself. That is the meaning of divine service, of the service which people can render to God, that light may emerge from the darkness, that the Creator may become conscious of His creation, and that people conscious of themselves. This is the goal, or one goal, which fits people meaningfully into the scheme of creation, and at the same time confers measuring meaning upon it. It is an exploratory myth which has solely taken shape within me in the course of the decades. It is a goal I can acknowledge and esteem, and which therefore satisfies me. By virtue of one's reflective faculties, people are raised out of the animal world, and by their mind they demonstrate that nature has put a high premium precisely upon the development of consciousness. Through consciousness one takes possession of nature by recognizing the existence of the world, and thus, as it were, confirming the Creator. The world becomes a phenomenal world, for without conscious reflection it would not be. If the Creator were conscious of Himself, He would not need conscious creatures, nor is it probable that the extremely indirect methods of creation, which squander millions of years upon the development of countless species and creatures, are the outcome of purposeful intention. Natural history tells us of a haphazard and causal transformation of species over hundreds of millions of years of devouring and being devoured. The biological and political history of people is an elaborate repetition of the same thing, but the history of the mind offers a different picture. Here the miracle of reflecting consciousness intervenes, the second cosmology. The importance of consciousness is so great that one cannot help suspecting the element of meaning to be concealed somewhere within all the monstrous, apparently senseless biological turmoil, and that the road to its manifestation was ultimately found on the level of warm-blooded vertebrates, possessed of a differentiated brain, found as if by chance, unintended and unforeseen, and yet somehow sensed, felt, and groped out for among the dark urge. I do not imagine that in my reflection on the meaning of man and his myth I have uttered a final truth, but I think that that this is what can be said in the end of our aeon of the fishes, and perhaps must be said in the view of the coming aeon of Aquarius, the water-bearer, who has a human figure, and is next in the sign of the fishes. This is the conjunctio oppositorium, composed of two fishes in reverse. The water-bearer seems to represent the self. With a sovereign gesture, he pours the contents of his jug into the mouth of Pisces au Sterinus, constellation of the southern fish. Its mouth is formed by Formalhut, Arabic for mouth of the fish, below the constellation of the water-bearer. End footnote. So Pisces Austrinius, which symbolizes a sun, a still unconscious content. Out of the unconscious content will emerge, after the passage of another aeon of more than 2,000 years, a future whose features are indicated by the symbol of the Capricorn, the Aigokyros, the monstrosity of the goatfish. Footnote: the constellation of Capricorn was originally called goatfish. End footnote. Symbolizing the mountains and the depths of the sea, a polarity made up of two undifferentiated animal elements which have grown together. This strange being could easily be primordial image of the Creator God confronting man, the anthropos. On this question there is a silence within me, as there is in the empirical data at my disposal, the products of the unconscious of other people with which I am acquainted, or historical documents. If insight does not come by itself, speculation is pointless. It makes sense only when we have objective data and comparable to our material on the aeon of Aquarius. We do not know how far the process of coming into consciousness can extend, or where it will lead. It is a new element in the story of creation, and there are no parallels we can look to. We therefore cannot know what potentialities are inherent in it, neither can we know the profits for the species of Homo sapiens. Will it intimate the fate of our species, which once flourished on the earth and now are extinct? Biology can advance no reasons why this should not be so. The need for mythic statements is satisfied when we frame a view of the world which adequately explains the meaning of human existence in the cosmos, a view which sprang from our psychic wholeness, from the cooperation between the conscious and the unconscious. Meaninglessness inhibits fullness of life and is therefore equivalent to illness. Meaning makes a great many things endurable, perhaps everything. No science will ever replace myth, and a myth cannot be made out of any science. For it is not that God is a myth, but that myth is the revelation of the divine in people. It is not we who invent myth, rather it speaks to us as a word of God. The word of God comes to us, and we have no way of distinguishing whether and to what extent it is different from God. There is nothing about this word that could not be considered known and human except for the manner in which it confronts us spontaneously and places obligation upon us. It is not affected by the arbitrary operation of our will. We cannot explain an inspiration. Our chief feeling about it is that it is not the result of our own ratiocinations, but that it came to us from elsewhere. And if we happen to have a precognitive dream, how can we possibly ascribe to it our own powers? After all, often we do not even know until some time afterward that the dream represents foreknowledge or knowledge of something that happened at a distance. The word happened to us, we suffer it, and we are victims of a profound uncertainty. With God as complexio oppositorium, all things are possible, in the fullest meaning of the phrase. Truth and delusion, good and evil, are equally possible. Myth is or can be equivocal, like the Orach of Delphi, or like a dream. We cannot and ought not to repudiate reason, but equally we must cling to the hope that instinct will hasten to our aid, in which case God is supported us against God, as Job long ago understood. Everything through which the other will is expressed proceeds from people, their thinking, their words, their images, and even their limitations. Consequently, one has the tendency to refer everything to oneself when one begins to think in clumsy psychological terms and decides that everything proceeds out of one's intentions and out of oneself. With childlike naivete, one assumes that one knows all one's own reaches and knows what one is in oneself. Yet, all the while, one is fatally handicapped by the weakness of one's consciousness and the corresponding fear of the unconscious. Therefore, one is utterly unable to separate what has carefully reasoned out from what has spontaneously flowed into one from another source. One has no objectivity towards oneself, and cannot yet regard oneself as a phenomenon which one finds in existence, and with which, for better or worse, one is identical. At first everything is thrust upon one, everything happens to one, and it is only by great effort that one finally succeeds in conquering and holding for oneself an area of relative freedom. Only when one has won their way in this achievement, and then only, is one in a position to recognize that one is confronting one's instinctual foundations, given one from the beginning, which one cannot make disappear, however much one would like to. One's beginnings are not by any means mere pasts. They live within one as the constant substration of one's existence, and one's consciousness is as much molded by them as by the physical world around one. These facts assail people from without and from within with overwhelming force. One has summed them up under the idea of a divinity, has described their effects with the aid of myth, and has interpreted this myth as the word of God, that is, as the inspiration and revelation of the Newman from the other side. Part 2. There is no better means of intensifying the treasured feelings of individuality than the possession of a secret which the individual is pledged to guard. The very beginnings of societal structures reveal the craving for secret organizations. When no valid secret really exists, mysteries are invented, not inverted, or contrived, to which privileged initiates are admitted. Such was the case with Rosicrucians and many other societies. Among these pseudo-secrets there are, ironically, real secrets of which the initiates are entirely unaware, as, for example, in those societies which borrowed their secret primarily from alchemical tradition. The need for ostentatious secrecy is of vital importance on the primitive level, for the shared secret serves as a cement binding the tribe together. Secrets on the tribal level constitute a helpful compensation for lack of cohesion in the individual personality, which is constantly relapsing into the original unconscious identity with other members of the group. Attainment of the human goal, an individual who is conscious in their own particular nature, thus becomes a long, almost hopeless process of education. For even the individuals whose initiation into certain secrets has marked them out in some way are fundamentally obeying the law of group identity, though in their case the group is a socially different one. The secret society is an intermediary stage on the way to individuation. The individual is still relying on a collective organization to effect their differentiation for them. That is, they have not yet recognized that it is really the individual's task to differentiate themselves from all others and stand on their own feet. All collective identities, such as membership in organizations, supports of isms, and so on, interfere with the fulfillment of this task. Such collective identities are crutches for the lame, shields for the timid, beds for the lazy, nurseries for the irresponsible. But they are equally shelters for the poor and weak, and home port for the shipwrecked, and a bosom for a family of orphans, and a land of promise for disillusioned vagrants, and weary pilgrims, and a herd and a safe fold for lost sheep, and a mother providing nourishment and growth. It would therefore be wrong to regard this intermediary stage as a trap, or as, on the contrary, for a long time to come it will represent the only possible form of existence for the individual, who nowadays seems more than ever threatened by anonymity. Collective organization is still so essential today that it may consider it, with some justification, to be the final goal, whereas to call for further steps along the road to autonomy, not anonymity, along the road to autonomy appear like arrogance or hubris, fantastically or simply folly. Nevertheless, it may be that for sufficient reasons a person feels they must set out on their own feet along the road to wider realms. It may be that in all the garbs, shapes, forms, modes, and manner of life offered to one does not find that it is particularly necessary for them. They will go alone and be their own company. They will serve as their own group, consisting of a variety of opinions and tendencies, which need not necessarily be marching in the same direction. In fact, one will be at odds with himself, and will find great difficulty in uniting one's own multiplicity for purposes of common action. Even if one is outwardly protected by the social form of the intermediary stage, one will have no defense against their inner multiplicity. This disunion within oneself may cause one to give up, to lapse into identity with one's surrounding. Like the initiate of a secret society who has broken free from the undifferentiated collectivity, the individual on their lonely path need a secret which for various reasons they may not or cannot reveal. Such a secret reinforces them in the isolation of their individual aims. A great many individuals cannot bear this isolation. They are neurotics, who necessarily play hide-and-seek with others as well as themselves without being able to take the game really seriously. As a rule, they end up surrendering their individual goal to their craving for collective conformity, a procedure, with all its opinions, beliefs, and ideals of their environment encouraged. Moreover, no rational argument prevails against the environment. Only a secret which the individual cannot betray, one which they fear to give away, or which they cannot formulate in words, and which therefore seems to belong to the category of crazy ideas, can prevent the otherwise inevitable retrogression. The need for such a secret, in many cases is so compelling, that the individual finds themselves involved in ideas and actions for which they are no longer responsible. They are being motivated neither by caprice nor arrogance, but by a dira necessitas, which they themselves cannot comprehend. This necessity comes drawn upon them with savage faithfulness, and perhaps for the first time in their life demonstrates to them ad oculos the presence of something alien and more powerful than themselves in their own personal domain, though where one thought themselves a master. A vivid example is the story of Jacob, who wrestled with the angels and came away with a dislocated hip, but by his struggle prevented a murder. In those fortunate days, Jacob's story was believed without question. A contemporary Jacob, telling a tale, would be treated to meaningful smiles. He would prefer not to speak of such matters, especially if he were inclined to have his private views about the nature of Yahweh's messenger. Thus he would find himself willy-nilly in possession of a secret that could not be discussed, and would become a deviant from the collectivity. Naturally, his mental reservation would ultimately come to light, unless he succeeded in playing the hypocrite all of his life. But anyone who attempts to do both, to adjust to his group, at the same time pursue his individual goal, becomes neurotic. Our modern Jacob would be concealing from himself the fact that the angel was, after all, the stronger of the two, as he certainly was, for no claims were ever made that the angel, too, came away with a limp. A person, therefore, who, driven by their daemon, steps beyond the limits of the intermediary stage, truly enters the untrodden, treadable regions. That's a quote from Faust Part 2. Where there are no charted ways, and no shelter spreads a protecting roof above one's head. There are no precepts to guide one when one encounters the unforeseen situation, for example, a conflict of duties. For the most part, these sallies into no man's land last only as long as no such conflicts occur, and come swiftly to an end as soon as conflict is sniffed from afar. I cannot blame the person who takes to their heels at once, but neither can I approve their finding merit in their weakness and cowardice. Since my contempt can do that person no further harm, I may as well say that I find nothing praiseworthy about such capitulations. But if a person faced with conflict of duties undertakes to deal with them absolutely on their own responsibility and before a judge who sits in judgment on them day and night, they may well find themselves in an isolated position. There is now an authentic secret in their life which cannot be discussed, if only because one is involved in an endless inner trial in which they are their own counsel and ruthless examiner, and no secular or spiritual judge can restore their easy sleep. If they were not already sick to death of the decision of such judges, they would never have found themselves in the conflict, for such a conflict always presupposes a higher sense of responsibility. It is this very quality which keeps its possessor from accepting the decision of a collectivity. In this case, the court is transported to the inner world, where the verdict is pronounced behind closed doors. Once this happens, the psyche of the individual acquires heightened importance. It is not only the seat of their well-known and socially defined ego, it is also the instrument for measuring what is worth in and of itself. Nothing so promotes the growth of consciousness as this inner confrontation of opposites. Quite unsuspected facts turn up in this incident, and the defense is obliged to discover arguments hitherto unknown. In the course of this, a considerable portion of the outer world reaches the inner, and by that very fact the outer world is impoverished or relieved. On the other hand, the inner world has gained that much weight by being raised to the rank of the tribunal of ethical decisions. However, the once unequivocal ego loses the prerogative of being merely the prosecutor. It must also learn the role of defendant. The ego becomes ambivalent and ambiguous, and is caught between hammer and anvil. It becomes aware of a polar subordinate to itself. By no means every conflict of duties, and perhaps not even a single one, is ever really solved, though it may be argued over, weighed, counterweighed, till doomsday. Sooner or later the decision is simply there, the product, as it would seem, of some kind of short-circuit. Practical life cannot be suspended in an everlasting contradiction. The opposites and the contradictions between them do not vanish, however, even when for a moment they yield before the impulse to action. They constantly threaten the unity of the personality and entangle life again and again in their dichotomies. Insight into the dangers and the painfulness of such a state might well decide one to stay at home, that is, never to leave the safe fold in the warm cocoon, since these alone promise protection from inner stress. Those who do not have to leave father and mother are certainly safest with them. A good many persons, however, find themselves thrust out upon the road to individuation. And it is in no time at all they will become acquainted with the positive and negative aspects of human nature. Just as all energy proceeds from opposites, so the psyche too possesses its inner polarity, that being the indispensable prerequisites for its aliveness, as Hercules realized long ago. Both theoretically and practically, polarity is inherent in all living things. Set against this overpowering force is the fragile unity of the ego, which has come into being in the course of millennium only with the aid of countless protective measures. That an ego was possible at all appears to spring from the fact that all opposites seek to achieve a state of balance. This happens in the exchange of energy, which results from the collision of hot and cold, high and low, and so on. The energy underlying conscious psychic life is pre-existent to it and therefore the first unconscious. As it approaches consciousness, it first appears projected in figures like mana, gods, and diamonds, whose numen seem to be the vital source of energy, and in point of fact is so as long as these supernatural figures are accepted. But as these fade and lose their force, the ego, that is, the empirical person, seems to come into possession of this source of energy, and does so in the fullest meaning of the ambiguous statement. On the one hand, one seeks to seize the energy, to possess it, and even imagine that one does possess it. On the other hand, one is possessed by it. This grotesque situation can, to be sure, occur only when the contents of the consciousness are regarded as the sole form of psychic existence. Where this is the case, there is no preventing inflation by projections coming home to roost. But where the existence of the unconscious psyche is admitted, the contents of the projection can be received into the inborn instinctive forms which predate consciousness. Their objectivity and autonomy are there preserved, and inflation is avoided. The archetypes, which are pre-existent to consciousness and condition it, appear in the part they actually play in reality, as a priori structural form of the stuff of consciousness. They do not in any sense represent things as they are in themselves, but rather the form in which things can be perceived and conceived. Naturally, it is not merely the archetypes that govern the particular nature of perceptions. They account only for the collective component of a perception. As an attribute of instinct, they partake of its dynamic nature and consequently possess a specific energy which causes or compels a definite modes of behavior or impulses. That is, they may, under certain circumstances, have a possessive or obsessive force of pneumosity. The conception of them as daimon is therefore quite in accord with their structure, with their nature. If anyone is inclined to believe that any aspect of the nature of things is changed by such formulations, they are being extremely credulous about words. The real facts do not change, whatever name we give them. Only we ourselves are affected. If one were to conceive of God in pure nothingness, that has nothing whatsoever to do with the fact of superordinate principle. We are just as much possessed as before. The change of name has removed nothing at all from reality. At most, we have taken a false attitude towards reality if a new name implies a denial. On the other hand, a positive name for the unknowable has the merit of putting us in a correspondingly positive attitude. If therefore we speak of God as an archetype, we are saying nothing about his real nature, but are letting it be known that God already has a place in that part of our psyche which is pre-existent to consciousness, and that he therefore cannot be considered an invention of consciousness. We neither make him more remote nor eliminate him, but bring him closer to the possibility of being experienced. This latter circumstance is by no means important, but a thing which cannot be experienced may easily be suspected as of non-existence. The suspicion is so inviting that so-called believers in God see nothing but atheism in my attempt to reconstruct the primitive unconscious psyche. Or if not atheism, then Gnosticism, anything, heaven forbid, but a psychic reality like the unconscious. If the unconscious is anything at all, it must consist of either evolutionary stages of our conscious psyche. The assumption that people in their whole glory were created on the sixth day of creation without any preliminary stage is, after all, somewhat too simple and archaic to satisfy us nowadays. There is pretty general agreement on that score. In regard to the psyche, however, the archaic conception holds on tenaciously. The psyche has no antecedents. It's a tabula rasa, arises renew at birth, and is only what it imagines itself to be. Consciousness is phylogenetically and ontogenetically a secondary phenomenon. In it is time that this obvious fact were grasped at last. Just as the body has an anatomical prehistory of millions of years, so also does the psychic system. And just as the human body today represents in each of its parts the result of this evolution, and everywhere still shows traces of its earlier stages, so the same may be said of the psyche. Consciousness began its evolution from an animal-like state which seems to us unconscious, and the same process of differentiation is repeated in every child. The psyche of the child in its pre-conscious state is anything but a tabula rasa. It is already performed in a recognizably individual way, and is moreover equipped with all specifically human instincts as well as the a priori foundations of the higher functions. On this complicated base the ego arises. Throughout life the ego is sustained by this base. When the base does not function, status ensues and then death. Its life and its reality are of vital importance. Compared to it, even the external world is secondary. For what does the world matter if the endogenous impulse to grasp it and manipulate it is lacking? In the long run, no conscience will ever replace the life instinct. This instinct comes to us from within as a compulsion or will or command, and if, as has been more or less been done from time immemorial, we give it the name of a personal diamond, we are at least aptly expressing the psychological situation. And if, by employing the concept of the archetype, we attempt to define a little more closely the point at which the diamond grips us, we have not abolished anything, only approached closer to the source. It is only natural that I, as a psychiatrist, doctor of the soul, should espouse such a view, for I am primarily interested in how I can help my patients find their healthy base again. To do that, a great variety of knowledge is needed, as I have learned. Medicine in general has, after all, proceeded in like manner. It has not made its advances through the discovery of some single trick of healing, thus phenomenally simplified its methods. On the contrary, it has evolved into a science of enormous complexity, not the least of the reasons being that it has made borrowings from all possible fields. Hence I am not concerned with proving anything to other disciplines. I am merely attempting to put their knowledge to good use in my own field. Naturally, it is incumbent upon me to report on such applications and their consequences. For certain new things come to light when one transfers the knowledge of one field to another and applies it in the practice. Had X-rays remained the exclusive property of physicists and not been applied in medicine, we would now know far less. Then again, if radiation therapy had in some circumstances dangerous consequences, this is interesting to the physician, but it is not necessarily of interest to the physicists, who uses radiation in an altogether different manner and for other purposes. Nor will she think that the physician has poached upon her territory when the latter points out certain harmful or salutary properties of the invisible rays. If I, for example, apply historical or theological insights in psychotherapy, they naturally appear in a different light and lead to conclusions other than those to which they lead when restricted to their proper fields, where they serve other purposes. The fact, therefore, that a polarity underlies the dynamics of the psyche means that the whole problem of opposites, in its broadest sense, with all concomitant religious and philosophical aspects, is drawn into the psychological discussion. These aspects lose the autonomous character they have in their own field, inevitably so, since they are approached in terms of the psychological questions, that is, they are no longer viewed from the angle of religious or philosophical truth, but are examined for their psychological validity and significance. Leaving aside their claim to be independent truths, the fact remains that regarded empirically, which is to say scientifically, they are primarily psychic phenomena. This fact seems to be incontestable. That they claim a justification for themselves is in keeping with a psychological approach, which does not brand such a claim unjustified, but on the contrary treats it with special consideration. Psychology has no room for judgments like only religious or only philosophical, despite the fact that we too often hear the charge of some things being only psychological, especially from theologians. All conceivable statements are made by the psyche. Among other things, the psyche appears as a dynamic process which rests on a foundation of antithesis, on a flow of energy between two poles. It is a general rule of logic that principles are not to be multiplied beyond their necessity. Therefore, since interpretation in terms of energy has proven a generally valid principle of explanation in the natural sciences, we must limit ourselves to it in psychology also. No firm facts are available, which would recommend some other view. Moreover, the antithetical or holistic nature of the psyche and its contents is verified by psychological experience. Footnote. Cf. on psychic energy in this structure and dynamics of the psyche, CW 8, end footnote. Now, if the dynamic conception of the psyche is correct, all statements which seek to overstep the limit of the psyche's polarity, statements about the metaphysical reality, for example, must be paradoxical if they are to lay claim to any sort of validity. The psyche cannot leap beyond itself. It cannot set up any absolute truths, for its own polarity determines the relativity of its statements. Wherever the psyche does announce absolute truths, such as, for example, God is motion or God is one, it necessarily falls into one or the other of its own antitheses. For the two statements might equally be God is rest or God is all. Through one-sidedness, the psyche disintegrates and loses its capacity for cognition. It becomes an unreflective, because unreflectable, succession of psychic states, each of which fancies itself its own justification because it does not, or does not yet, see the other state. In saying this, we are not expressing a value judgment, but only pointing out that the limit is very frequently overstepped. Indeed, this is inevitable, for as Heraclitus says, everything's in flux. Thesis is followed by antithesis, and between the two is generated a third factor, a lysis, which was not perceptible before. In this, the psyche once again merely just demonstrates its antithetical nature, and at no point has really got it outside itself. In my effort to depict the limitations of the psyche, I do not mean to imply that only the psyche exists. It is merely that, so far as perception and cognition are concerned, we cannot see beyond the psyche. Science is tacitly convinced that a non-psychic transcendental object exists, but science also knows how difficult it is to grasp the real nature of the object, especially when the organ of perception fails or is lacking, and when the appropriate modes of thought do not exist or have still to be created. In cases where neither our sense organs nor their artificial aids can attest to the presence of a real object, the difficulties mount enormously, so that one feels tempted to assert that there is simply no real object present. I have never drawn this over-hasty conclusion, for I have never been inclined to think that our senses are capable of perceiving all forms of being. I have, therefore, even haphazard the postulate that the phenomenon of archetypal configuration, which are psychic events par excellence, may be founded upon a psychoid base, that is, upon an only partially psychic and possibly altogether different form of being. For lack of empirical data, I have neither knowledge nor understanding of such forms of being, which are commonly called spiritual. From the point of view of science, it is immaterial that I may believe on that score, and I must accept my ignorance. But insofar as the archetypes act upon me, they are real and actual to me, and, even though I do not know what their real nature is, this applies, of course, not only to the archetypes, but to the nature of the psyche in general. Whatever it may state about itself, it will never get beyond itself. All comprehension and all that is comprehended is in itself psychic, and to the extent we are hopelessly co-opted by an exclusively psychic world. Nevertheless, we have good reason to suppose that beyond this veil there exists the incomprehensible absolute object which affects and influences us, and to suppose that even, or particularly in the case of psychic phenomenon, about which no verifiable statements can be made. Statements concerning possibility or impossibility are valid only in specialized fields. Outside those fields, they are merely arrogant presumptions. Prohibited though it may be from an object point of view to make statements about out of the blue, that is, without sufficient reason, there are nevertheless some statements which apparently have to be made without objective reason. The justification here is a psychodynamic one, of the sort usually termed subjective and regarded as purely personal matter. But that is to commit the mistake of failing to distinguish whether the statement really proceeds only from an isolated subject and is prompted by exclusively personal motives, or whether it occurs generally and springs from a collectively present dynamic pattern. In that case, it should not be classified as subjective, but as psychologically objective, since an indefinite number of individuals find themselves prompted by an inner impulse to make an identical statement or feel a certain view to be a vital necessity. Since the archetype is not just an inactive form, but a real force charged with a specific energy, it may well be regarded as a causa effectiens of such statements, and be understood as the subject of them. In other words, it is not the personal human being who is making the statement, but the archetype speaking through him or her. If this statement were stifled or disregarded, both medical expertise and common knowledge demonstrates that psychic troubles are in store. These will appear either as neurotic symptoms or, in the case of persons who are incapable of neurosis, collective delusions. Archetypal statements are based upon instinctive preconditions and have nothing to do with reason. They are neither rationally grounded nor can they be banished by rational argument. They have always been part of the world, representations collectives, as Lévi-Brühl rightly called them. Certainly the ego and its will have a great part to play in life, but the ego wills its subjects in the highest degree to the interference in a way in which the ego is actually aware of the autonomy and pneumosity of archetypal processes. Practical consideration of these processes is the essence of religion, in so far as religion can be approached from the psychological point of view. Part 3. At this point, the fact forces itself upon my attention that beside the field of reflection there is another equally broad, if not broader, area in which rational understanding and rational modes of representation find scarcely anything they are able to grasp. This is the realm of Eros. In classical times, when such things were properly understood, Eros was considered a god whose divinity transcended our human limits, and who therefore could neither be comprehended nor represented in any way. I might, as many before me have attempted to, venture an approach to this daimon, whose range of activity extends from the endless space of the heavens to the dark abyss of hell, but I falter before the task of finding the language which might adequately express the incalculable paradoxes of love. Eros is cosmogenos, a creator and father-mother of all higher consciousness. I sometimes feel that Paul's words, quote, though I speak with the tongue of men and of angels, and have not love, quote unquote, might well be the first condition of all cognition and the quintessence of divinity itself. Whatever the learned interpretation may be of the sentence "God is love," the words affirm the complexio oppositorium of the Godhead. In my medieval experience, as well as my own life, in my medical experience, as well as my own life, I have again and again been faced with the mystery of love and have never been able to explain it, what it is. Like Job, I had to, quote, lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once and I will not answer, Job 44f. Here is the greatest and smallest, the remotest and nearest, the highest and lowest. We cannot discuss one side of it without also discussing the other. No language is adequate to this paradox. Whatever one can say, no words express the whole. To speak of the partial aspects is always too much or too little, for only the whole is meaningful. Love bears all things and endures all things. Corinthians 13:7. These words say all there is to be said. Nothing can be added to them. For we are in the deepest sense the victims and the instruments of cosmologic love. I put the words in quotation marks to indicate the word love. Do not use it in its connotations of desiring, preferring, favoring, wishing, and similar feelings, but as something superior to the individual, and undivided and a unified whole. Being apart, people cannot grasp the whole. One is at its mercy. One may assent to it or rebel against it, but one is always caught up by it and enclosed within it. One is dependent upon it and is sustained by it. Love is one's light and one's darkness, whose end one cannot see. Quote, love ceases not, unquote. Whether one speaks with the tongue of angels or with the scientific exactitude traces the line of the cell down to the uttermost source. People can try to name love, showering upon it all the names at their command, but still they will involve themselves in endless self-deceptions. If one possesses a grain of wisdom, one will lay down one's arms and name the unknown by the more unknown, ignotum per ignotius, that is, by the name of God. That is a confession of their subjugation, their imperfections, their dependence, but at the same time a testimony to one's freedom to choose between truth and error. Reader's commentary. So this is interesting in this late thoughts. Jung is dealing with these issues of good and evil and of separatism, tribalism, and then of love, which is a little bit more of a sort of like an afterthought instead of a late thought, I would think. And I like his solution of good and evil, that that it's not about that people like those bad people. I'm trying to be a good person, but really integrating the good and the evil inside oneself, and that's really the journey. And in terms of the second piece about tribalism and the isms of experiencing, having the experience of the numinous, having the experience of being the one, and not trying to turn it into a dualistic situation. And I think that just naturally goes to where I think that's where love emerged. So sometimes when I had a staff and managed a staff, we would have meetings, and one of the meetings sometimes once a year, I would ask people, like, what is your purpose? And then we'd go down to 3 to 7 levels, just keeping asking, like, why? And oftentimes, half or fewer, up to half of the people would say that their ultimate purpose in life is love. And I think that's a very true purpose. If you've listened this far, thank you, and love.